Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for attending or tuning into our 41st episode of the Peaceable Kingdom Hour, which is titled Presbyterianism. My name is Matthew A. King, and I am your host. This live stream is made possible in collaboration with allcreatures.org, leading the way in faith-based vegan animal rights since 1998, and with the Christian Animal Rights Association, a non-denominational Bible-based ministry. All opinions and teachings expressed in this series are the commentaries of me, Matthew A. King. And so for the teaching agenda today, we're going to talk about first a disclaimer. Then we're going to talk about the definition, history, and distinct beliefs of Presbyterianism. Followed by, we're going to have a discussion on John Calvin and John Knox. Those are some names you're going to hear that are associated with Presbyterianism. We'll also talk about Calvin's respect for animals and some famous quotes of his about animals, which there's surprisingly a lot. And then there's also a quote from a more modern Presbyterian about animals like Douglas Wilson. And so I'll quote him later on, but he's a modern Presbyterian. And so as you can see, the Presbyterianism is pretty sympathetic to animal rights. But first, a disclaimer. Obviously, as we work through Protestantism and we talk about the Protestant Reformation and these different denominations within the Protestant Reformation, those are inherently sort of divisive and sort of hostile towards Catholicism. And so, if you're Catholic, you might find some of their words offensive, but it's not intended to be that way. It's just, showing what they said about it. But it's not intended to be offensive. And, if you feel uncomfortable, feel free to step out at any time. But to start out, what exactly is Presbyterianism? And so to put it, pretty mildly, it's kind of a boring definition. But basically, it's for most people, the word Presbyterian carries with it the ideas of distinctive practices and teachings of churches that go by that name, such as Reformed theology, covenantal baptism, liturgical worship, a confession of faith, and a book of church order. Although these doctrinal matters certainly fit within the historical context of Presbyterianism, the biblical essence of Presbyterianism has little to nothing to do with any of these specifics. Rather, the essential concept of Presbyterianism has to do with the biblical form of church government. Presbyterianism is founded on the idea of a plurality of elders and the connectivity of local churches for governance, accountability, and ministerial collaboration. Presbyterianism derives its name and ideas from the Greek word presbyteros. And as you'll see, that's a modern word that we still use, actually. And that word's found in many places in the New Testament. And as you can see there, it's in the book of Acts many times, 1 Timothy, Titus, 1 Peter, and James. So it's a pretty frequent word in the New Testament. But translators of English versions of the New Testament have translated the word presbyteros as elder. And you'll see too that that's a word, elder, that is also used like in medical language, like presbyopia, for instance, means like you basically have the eyes of an old person. That's what that means. Elderly eyes is sort of the root word, meaning your eyes have sort of aged, and that's why you're having problems with it. The word presbyteros is synonymous with the Greek word episkopos, which is translated overseer, and that's in Philippians 1:1 and 1 Timothy 3:1-2 and Titus 1:7. But the word presbyteros captures with it the idea of the dignity of the office of an elder, whereas the word episkopos expresses the function of the office. There is a need for a plurality of elders on a local church level, and so each local congregation in the apostolic age was overseen by elders. So basically, Presbyterian is sort of this idea that the church is run by elders, and that's something that they take very seriously. And actually, episkopos, meaning overseer, that's a word also that has a modern usage, like Episcopal. That's something Episcopalian. We'll talk about that in about a month. But the idea that the apostolic age was overseen by elders, this is evident from Paul's appeal to the elders in the church in Ephesus. And that's within Acts 20:17-38. And it is also demonstrated by the way in which Paul charged Titus to appoint elders in every town. And that's Titus 1:5. And so the collective nature of the elders of each congregation coming together to form a general assembly is founded on the teaching of the scripture about the Jerusalem Council, which is in Acts 15. So it has this sort of solid church basis that the Jerusalem Council is the reason that Presbyterians have elders. And the Jerusalem Council, what was decided on that, I talked about that in Pride Goes Before Destruction quite a bit, about how it asked for restrictions of Christians, which was refrain from sexual immorality, refrain from blood, and refrain from meat that was sacrificed to idols. And then also, what was the fourth one? I can't remember. But anyways, Yeah, it was the um what actually I gotta look it up now. I'm drawing a blank. Jerusalem Council Apostolic Decree, I believe it was called. Let me just look that up real quick. The Apostolic Decree, yeah, it says primarily focused on abstaining from things sacrificed to idols, abstaining from blood and things or meat that came from strangled animals, and sexual immorality. So that was the idea of abstaining from those four things. But Luke tells us that the apostles and the elders were gathered together to deliberate on the threat of false teaching in the early church. And so among the actions they took, Luke says it seemed good to the apostles and the elders with the whole church. So that's in Acts 15:6 and Acts 22. It is common for Presbyterian ministers to speak of higher courts when referring to the local, regional, and national ministerial meetings. Accordingly, the local church with its elders constitutes the lowest court. The regional body of teaching and ruling elders forms the higher court. And so the national gathering, which is the General Assembly of Teaching and Ruling Elders, makes up the highest court. However, certain Presbyterian theologians have chosen to speak of these as wider rather than higher courts, and that's because of Catholicism. Since Presbyterianism principally avoids any movement toward hierarchical ecclesiology, so the idea is that it sort of rejects this idea of hierarchy within the church. Like the Catholic Church, everybody answers to the Pope. And so the Presbyterians have been very reactive to that and saying that it's basically there's a wider court rather than a higher court. And so they're kind of on the same level. And there's the hierarchy is very much resisted. In church history, Presbyterianism found its rudimentary principles in the teaching of reformers, most notably through the ministry of John Knox. And that's a name that you'll hear a lot in this teaching. John Knox had gleaned the essential principles of Presbyterianism when he was in Geneva under the ministry of John Calvin. And so John Calvin is a very influential theologian, probably the second biggest reformer after Martin Luther. I think that would probably not be disputed. But I had never really heard of John Calvin until probably about 15 years ago. But I think everybody knows about Martin Luther. But yeah, John Calvin, pretty well known. But he's responsible behind a lot of the Protestant Reformation. However, it was implemented in Scotland in the 16th century in reaction to the abuses of the Roman Catholic Church and its unbiblical, hierarchical, and authoritarian ecclesiology. And so, as you can see, Presbyterianism is very much a reaction to Catholicism. In this sense, it can be said that the Reformation was a reformation of biblical ecclesiology, no less than it was a reformation of biblical soteriology and worship. Presbyterianism spread from Scotland to other parts of the Western world, and then toward the end of the 17th century, Francis Makemie planted the first Presbyterian church in North America. From those small origins burgeoned an extremely influential Presbyterianism in America. So Presbyterianism really took off in the United States, and you can see that too. I mean, even like in Pittsburgh, where I'm from, there's a lot of Presbyterian churches, very, very common. In 1727, the Scottish Presbyterian William Tennant started the Log College in Warminster, Pennsylvania. And so there we are. That's not too far from me. In turn, a number of Log College men became trustees of the College of New Jersey, which would become Princeton University and Princeton Theological Seminary. And so Princeton has very much a connection with Presbyterianism and very much associated historically, maybe not so much anymore. Throughout the 19th century, Princeton Theological Seminary was a bastion of Reformed and Presbyterian theological training. And when the modernist movement infiltrated Princeton Theological Seminary and the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America, leavening them with theological liberalism, J. Gresham Machen joined with other Presbyterian pastors and theologians to form Westminster Theological Seminary in 1929 and the Orthodox Presbyterian Church in 1936. And so Princeton Theological Seminary and Princeton were Princeton University was invaded with sort of like liberal ideology from modernity, which was science. And so a reaction to that, it sort of created this Westminster Theological Seminary as well as the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. So how you have these divisions starting already within Presbyterianism. And so the Presbyterian Church in America followed suit with its formation in 1973. And then in 1788, American Presbyterians adopted the preliminary principles of Presbyterianism. After their emendations and adoption by various Presbyterian bodies, there are 8 preliminary principles of Presbyterianism in American Presbyterianism. The first preliminary principle is that God alone is Lord of the conscience and hath left it free from the doctrine and commandments of men, which are in anything contrary to his word or beside it in a matter of faith or worship. And so closely related to this is the 7th preliminary principle that all church power is only ministerial and declarative. And so there again is another idea too, where it's anti-hierarchical. The ministerial and declarative nature of Presbyterianism is the essence of biblical Presbyterianism. And so presently there are upwards of 40 Presbyterian denominations in the United States. As you can see, a lot of different denominations, even within Presbyterianism. It's like that joke. At the end of time, every Protestant will have his own church because they can't seem to stay together regardless of their differences. And some of them are very trivial too. Like I know with my father-in-law and my brother-in-law, they actually have a split within the family because my father-in-law is an associate Reformed Presbyterian and my brother-in-law is a Reformed Presbyterian. And the difference is very minute. Basically, the Reformed Presbyterian only does a cappella music, and the Associated Reform only does a cappella as well as instruments. And so it's trivial sort of things like that they disagree on. And apologies, by the way, if that's sort of offensive, but it's just not intended to be because it's, relatively speaking, I think it's trivial. But the largest theologically conservative Presbyterian denomination in North America is the Presbyterian Church in America. And there are nearly 75 million members in Presbyterian churches worldwide, with nearly 6 million in North American Presbyterian churches. And so as you can see, 75 million members worldwide, and then 6 million in the United States and Canada, which is a pretty big number. And so there's the source for that too, from ligonier.org. And then I had a comment come through. Monique said, "Why is leaving animals alone so inflexible for eating consumers? Seems obvious to me. 25 years. Congratulations. Sounds like you've been vegan for 25 years. That's great. And that's fantastic. And well, yeah, and it's, like I always say too, we're fighting human nature, unfortunately, and that's something that is not easily grappled with, and it's unfortunate. We live in a fallen world with fallen people, and far from the idealism and far from the ideal that we would like to be and wish we were. But I wanted to jump into a little bit of Presbyterian church history. I touched on it briefly a couple minutes ago, but the history of the Presbyterian Church traces back to John Calvin, a 16th century French reformer, and John Knox, who lived from 1514 to 1572. So as you can see, it's sort of around the same time as Martin Luther. John Knox was the leader of the Protestant Reformation in Scotland, and Knox's unrelenting efforts transformed Scotland into the most Calvinistic country in the world and the cradle of modern-day Presbyterianism. And so Scotland is very much intertwined with Presbyterianism because of John Knox. In the United States, the Presbyterian Church derives its origin primarily from the Presbyterians of Scotland and Ireland, along with the influence of French Huguenots and Dutch and German Reformed immigrants. And so Presbyterian Christians are not bound together in one large denomination, but in an association of independent churches. And so John Calvin, Reformation giant, he's one that I really couldn't avoid talking about with Presbyterianism. John Calvin trained for the Catholic priesthood, but later converted to the Reformation movement and became a theologian and minister who revolutionized the Christian church in Europe, America, and ultimately the rest of the world. Calvin dedicated a great deal of thought to practical matters such as the ministry, the church, religious education, and the Christian life. He was more or less coerced into leading the Reformation in Geneva, Switzerland. And there's actually a college outside of Pittsburgh called Geneva College, and I think that's very much a Protestant school. And so that probably gets its name from Geneva, Switzerland. Not sure. I would guess, though. And in 1541, the Town Council of Geneva enacted Calvin's ecclesiastical ordinances, which set forth regulations on issues related to church order, religious training, gambling, dancing, and even swearing. And so Calvin's ideas spread all the way to Switzerland's city ordinances. And so he was widely influential, not only influencing just the church, but also local governments, which is actually amazing. Strict church disciplinary measures were enacted to deal with those who broke these ordinances. And Calvin's theology was very similar to Martin Luther's. That's something I sort of mentioned. He agreed with Luther on the doctrines of original sin, justification by faith alone, the priesthood of all believers, and the sole authority of the scriptures. He distinguishes himself theologically from Luther primarily with the doctrines of predestination and eternal security. And so that's something that Luther and Calvin disagreed on too, was Calvin is very much all about predestination, which is something we'll get into briefly, but probably a teaching I could make all in itself. But Calvinism is basically the idea that its opposition is Arminianism. And Calvinism is this idea that God creates and chooses those he saves, and that the human or the person has no ability to save themselves. And so they have no idea, no decision to choose for themselves. They were elected by God to be saved, and that's the way it is. Now, there's problems with that, because then it's like, well, does God just create people to go to hell? So that's obviously the big theological question with that. Whereas Arminianism says that, man has some sort of, he can choose to reject it, is sort of the idea. And I'll do a teaching on that eventually too, about Calvinism versus Arminianism, because that's something that is radically divided the churches. And there's people actually on Facebook that still argue about those things. And so I don't believe in arguing about it, just because it's sort of unknowable. It's like Got Questions had a really great solution to that problem. It said, there's scriptures to support both. There's no way of really knowing. And so, what are you going to do? It's just subjective. What you want to believe is what you believe, and that's okay. And there's not really a good answer to it. And then also eternal security was something that he disagreed with Luther. Basically, the idea that you could not lose your salvation, whereas Luther thought you could, is what it sounds like. But the Presbyterian concept of church elders is based on Calvin's identification of the office of elder as one of the four ministries of the church, along with pastors, teachers, and deacons. And so church elders, they basically split the church into pastors, teachers, deacons, and elders. And so that's very much how churches run today, especially in Presbyterianism. And so it's that idea of how a church should run is sort of something that's very important to Presbyterians. Whereas, Lutheran theology was more concerned about the rejection of Catholicism. Presbyterianism kind of did its own thing as far as structure. Elders participate in preaching, teaching, and administering the sacraments. And as in 16th century Geneva, church governance and discipline today includes elements of Calvin's ecclesiastical ordinances, but these no longer have power beyond the members' willingness to be bound by them. And so, meaning the government and the church are no longer intertwined with one another in most localities. And then I want to talk about the influence of John Knox on Presbyterianism, because he was another one besides Calvin that was widely influential and very important. If there's anything I want you to take away from Presbyterianism, it's the importance of John Calvin and John Knox. But second in importance to John Calvin in the history of Presbyterianism is John Knox. He lived in Scotland in the mid-1500s and led the Reformation there, following Calvinistic principles, protesting against the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots, and Catholic practices. His ideas set the moral tone for the Church of Scotland and also shaped its democratic form of government. The Presbyterian form of church government and Reformed theology were formally adopted as the National Church of Scotland in 1690. The Church of Scotland remains Presbyterian today. Presbyterianism in America. So since the colonial period, Presbyterianism has had a strong presence in the United States of America, like we informed. Reformed churches were first established in the early 1600s, with Presbyterians shaping the religious and political life of the newly established nation. So Presbyterianism was widely available in the colonial days, and I believe a lot of founding fathers actually were Presbyterian, and so that makes sense. Probably deistic as well. But the only Christian minister to sign the Declaration of Independence, this is interesting, was Reverend John Witherspoon, a Presbyterian. And so he was a Christian minister, and he actually was a Presbyterian, and he signed the Declaration of Independence. So as you can see, there were Presbyterians involved in the early American government. And in many ways, the United States is founded on a Calvinistic point of view, with emphasis on hard work, discipline, the salvation of souls, and the building of a better world. And that's true about a lot of Presbyterians. A lot of Presbyterians are post-millennial in this idea that we should try to make the world like the Garden of Eden again. And that's something that you'll see, too, in a lot of theology, like with Douglas Wilson, who I'll quote later. You'll see that as well. Presbyterians were instrumental in the movement for women's rights, the abolition of slavery, and temperance, or sort of the abstention of alcohol. And also, I would argue, animal rights as well. The present-day Presbyterian Church USA is rooted in the formation of the Presbyterian General Assembly in 1788. So these dates go way back. It has remained the major judicatory body of the church ever since. And during the Civil War, American Presbyterians divided into southern and northern branches, naturally as the whole nation did. These two churches reunited in June of 1983 to form the Presbyterian Church USA, the largest Presbyterian/Reformed denomination in the United States. And there's the source on that. And then I had some comments come through. That's just I had a troll there. I'm going to ignore that one. And so back to the distinctive marks of Presbyterianism. And so a belief in Presbyterianism is distinguished with three essential marks. And this is what's important too about what distinguishes Presbyterianism from other denominations. One is a belief in the sovereignty of God, which means that basically God can do whatever he wants. Two is a belief in covenant theology, or basically that the covenants unite the Bible. And three, a belief in a church government led by elders. And so again, that's a very important topic within Presbyterianism, is how elders are in charge of the church, or the church government is led by elders. That's a very important Presbyterian sticking point. Presbyterian doctrines and practices are summarized in the historic Westminster Confession of Faith, which that's a very famous document written in 1647, and then the Westminster Larger and Shorter Catechisms, which are also well known. But the practical outworking of these beliefs can be found in the Book of Church Order, used by various Presbyterian denominations, and so that's a book you could probably check out. The church historian Dr. S. Donald Fortson III describes who Presbyterians are in this way. And he said, being Presbyterian involves multiple layers of identity and connection. As Christian Presbyterians are Catholic, sharing the common heritage of ancient Christianity with all believers of all times, in all places, Presbyterians are Protestant by conviction, sharing the rich spiritual heritage of the 16th century and reaffirming the primacy of Scripture and the rediscovery of the gospel. Within the 16th century Protestant Reformation, Presbyterians identify themselves uniquely with one of the church families known as the Reformed tradition. And that's something that you'll see too, is like a lot of churches are called, they're not called Calvinism, like Lutheranism is based off Martin Luther. A lot of what is based on Calvin's teachings is what's known as the Reformed tradition, or Reformed theology is something you'll hear, not Calvinism, because that's something unrelated. It's if a doctrine comes from Calvin's ideas, that's known as the Reformed tradition. So Presbyterianism falls under that. But in this stream, Presbyterians view themselves in special connection to the reforms of John Calvin, John Knox, and the English Puritans. And so the Puritans were some of the first people that came to America, as we know, interacted with the Native Americans like Pocahontas, as the story goes. Historically, Presbyterians are also part of the evangelical movement. That is, they have embraced the legacy of the 18th century revivals or awakenings in America and Britain, and thus believe in the necessity of conversion experience, personal holiness, and being missional. Each of these historic layers is equally important to Presbyterian identity. And so that's sort of like a rough summary of what Presbyterianism is. And that was from S. Donald Fortson III in the Presbyterian Story, page 7. And so the distinct Presbyterian beliefs by subject, that's something that I wanted to talk about as well. So there's the sovereignty of God. The Bible teaches that God is in control of all events, meaning, God can basically do whatever he wants, both the good and the bad. And so sovereignty means that God rules and reigns in the midst of all circumstances, accomplishing all of his holy will. And they cite many scriptures to claim that, like Genesis and Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Acts, Romans, James, and 1 Peter. You can read those on your own. This does not mean that God is responsible for the evil behavior of men, rather that all men are without excuse for their sins and will answer to God for their wicked behavior. And so there's that. The doctrine of sovereignty in regard to salvation is best summarized by the doctrines of grace, which are known as the 5 points of Calvinism. And that's sort of what I was talking about too, is TULIP, which Calvin, that was a big part of what he made, was these 5 points of Calvinism. And so I'm not going to go into this fully. I'll go into this another time, but it's summarized with the acronym of TULIP. And T means total depravity or total inability, which means that man has no ability to save himself, meaning God is the one that reaches people and then pulls them into himself for salvation. And man has no choice in the matter. And then U is unconditional election, meaning that you have no choice in the matter. You were chosen by God to be saved. Then L is limited atonement, meaning that not everybody is saved, which is in contrast to universalism, which means like Unitarian Universalist believes that everybody is going to be saved. Limited atonement means that everybody will not be saved, only who God chooses. And then irresistible grace is another one, I. That basically just means that you have no ability to resist God's call to be saved. And so that's all within his power. And then P is perseverance of the saints, or eternal security. That's another idea of Calvin's. That he pulls from the Bible, obviously, but it's the idea that once you're called by God, you can't lose your salvation. And then, that brings up the question of, well, what about Christians that walk away from it? And it's like, well, they were never really saved in the first place. And it gets into no true Scotsman fallacies and things like that. So it's not something I fully embrace all the way, but I understand it. But a covenant theology, God is related to certain people throughout history, his people, And so the thinking of national Israel as the people of God was the initial pattern for understanding the doctrine. However, it is clear that they are not all Israel who are descended from Israel. And that's Romans 9:6. So a lot of what's going on in Israel right now, that's not something that a lot of Presbyterians are usually concerned with. A lot of that is dispensationalist theology, which is the rapture and all this other stuff. And that's not really something a lot of Presbyterians interact with. And so thus God's people are those who are the spiritual descendants of Abraham rather than the physical descendants of Abraham. And so if you're a Christian, you are a spiritual descendant of Abraham. And that's made clear within Romans 2, Romans 9, Galatians 3, and Ephesians 2. So that's something you can read. But the relationship that God has enjoyed with his people has been shown through a series of expanding covenants. Each covenant has had blessings that came with obedience and curses that came with disobedience. And so that's something, the nature of the covenant is if you obey, you're rewarded. If you disobey, you're punished. But each covenant is progressive in that through time, God has revealed more of his redemptive plan to successive generations. And so the new covenant expands access to the gospel. So rather than just being ethnic Israel, it becomes all of Israel, meaning the church or, the spiritual descendants of Israel. But the ultimate expression of God's covenantal relationship is revealed in the new covenant, which is accomplished by the redemptive work of Jesus Christ on the cross. And so God's covenant people are believers, their children, and all who are in the visible church. These are two sacraments ordained by Jesus Christ. It's the same thing as Lutheranism, the Lord's Supper and baptism. And so that's the two sacraments that Presbyterianism takes, whereas Catholics have like 8 sacraments that aren't necessarily sacraments within the Bible. But the Lord's Supper is a memorial feast where Christ is spiritually present in the hearts of every believer, as taught by Martin Bucer, John Calvin, John Knox, Charles Hodge, A.A. Hodge. And so believers, both adult and children, are admitted to the Lord's table upon giving a credible confession of faith to the elders of the local church. Both adult believers' baptism and infant baptism are practiced in Presbyterian churches as a sign of our identification with Christ and our entrance into the visible church. And so that's another sticking point, too, is that like Baptists, they only do adult baptism, whereas Presbyterians, they do both adult believer baptism as well as infant baptism as a sign of identification with Christ and also an entrance into the visible church. And so there's some symbology going on there. But infant baptism is based upon the covenant made by God with Abraham and his descendants, and that's in Genesis 17. But the children of believers are part of the covenant by virtue of their birth and are thereby entitled to its benefits and liable under its sanctions. And so what that means is the children of believers well, you know what? You can read more about it in Acts 2, 1 Corinthians 7, Ephesians 6. And then also the issue of circumcision. In the New Testament, the practice of circumcision has been superseded by baptism, and they cite Colossians 2 with that. And that, again, something worth repeating, something that sort of defines Presbyterianism, a church government led by elders. And so the Old Testament speaks of the practice of appointing elders. For example, Jethro gave his son-in-law Moses wise advice concerning the difficulty of leading the entire nation of Israel all by himself. And that was in Exodus 18. So that was sort of an example of an early elder. He urged Moses to pick out men of sound character to oversee all of the minor disputes. And so Moses would then be able to decide the major disputes that the elders could not handle. And so this practice was a prelude to the New Testament paradigm that would be developed by Jesus Christ when he selected his disciples. And so Moses sort of had overarching authority where he gave elders, as we would see them, ability to dispute minor altercations. But the New Testament uses the Greek word presbyteros to refer to elders and older men in Titus 2:2. And so, for example, Paul instructed Timothy and Titus, both of whom were younger pastors, to seek out mature men to serve the local church as overseers or elders. And that's in 2 Timothy 2:2. The specific qualifications for these local church leaders are given so that the character of each candidate might be thoroughly evaluated by the congregation. And so that's in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1, sort of talks about who is a candidate for an elder. And I think my brother-in-law, actually, of my wife's sister, is an elder within Presbyterianism, Presbyterian church. And so after evaluating a man's life, doctrine, family, and character, the church confirms the calling of God by electing that man an elder. And so the church confirms this person based on his life, his doctrine, what he believes, his family, and how his character is, and then that confirms the election for an elder. Duly elected elders can serve Christ's church in several different capacities, such as an evangelist, a pastor, and a teacher. And so that's in Ephesians 4:11. So that's something that Presbyterians do too, is if you get elected as an elder, you can serve a lot of functions in the church, like helping out with communion, taking over for the pastor on certain weeks, maybe when he's on vacation. So you become sort of an important part of the church when you're an elder, and you have various responsibilities. But there are two other Greek words implying church authority that the Bible speaks of as well, which is diakonos, which is deacon, and then episkopos, which is overseer or bishop, which is Episcopalian. And so within a Presbyterian form of government, deacons are elected by the congregation for the purpose of meeting the physical needs of the people, visiting the sick, and administering the possessions of the church. In many respects, the presbytery serves as the episkopos over a group of churches in a specific region and is made up of all the regional elders. Rather than investing authority in a single individual to serve as a bishop, the collective wisdom of a plurality of godly elders is emphasized in decision-making for the whole church. And so they have a wide variety of elders, too, to have decision-making priority. But beyond that, the church has an annual meeting of elders from all the regional presbyteries for the purpose of gathering together in a general assembly. And that's based on Acts 15 with the Jerusalem Council. And that's something, my father-in-law is a Presbyterian pastor, and so that's something that he takes part in as well. I know he has certain months out of the year where he goes to assembly. And so this one's sort of, I'm pretty intimate with Presbyterianism. And then we're going to talk about, too, what is the Presbyterian church and what do Presbyterians believe? But the name Presbyterian applies to a diverse group of churches that adhere in some degree to the teachings of John Calvin and John Knox, as we talked about. And they practice a Presbyterian form of church government led by representative elders or presbyters, which means elder or older. The polity of Presbyterian churches calls for local congregations to elect a board called the session or consistory. Congregations also elect presbyters who form a presbytery to govern regional groups of local churches. And so a lot of this is a little bit dry, but it's sort of like how Presbyterians are thinking and why they call themselves Presbyterians. That's a big part of it, is how the church is structured is really what they name it after. Whereas like Lutheranism is named after Martin Luther and his teachings. A lot of Presbyterianism is based out of the Reformed tradition and then also how the church operates. Presbyterians are then overseen by synods, and all the synods together form the General Assembly. And so within the broad category of Presbyterianism, there are some churches that can be considered conservative or fundamental, and some that would be called liberal or progressive. And that's something that you see in pretty much all churches is there's liberal ones and there's progressive ones. There's liberal and progressive, and there's also conservative ones. Like on the conservative side is the Presbyterian Church in America, or the PCA, with about 335,000 members and 1,700 congregations. And then on the liberal side is the Presbyterian Church USA, or PCUSA, with about 2 million members and 10,000 congregations. So several smaller groups of Presbyterians have formed over the years and cover the spectrums of beliefs and practices. The Presbyterian Church was first organized in Scotland under the leadership of the reformer John Knox. The Church of Scotland was affiliated with the Roman Catholic Church, and even though it maintained an attitude of independence, John Knox was a priest in the Church of Scotland and was fed up with the abuses he saw in the Catholic leadership. So there's a general theme there. Same thing with Martin Luther, where he's fed up with Catholicism and its leadership, and so he breaks away. John Knox, same thing, was a priest in Catholicism, decided he had enough of the abuses, and then saw a way out. So Knox was exiled to England after his involvement in the murder of Cardinal Beaton in 1546. While in England, he was licensed to preach in the Church of England and was instrumental in reforming the Book of Common Prayer. When Mary Tudor ascended the English throne and started her bloody persecutions of Protestants, Knox fled to the continent, where he met John Calvin and began to study Reformed theology. In 1559, Knox fled to the continent and that was because of the bloody persecutions of Mary Tudor. John Knox fled, and then that's where he met John Calvin, and then his Reformation principles only got stronger. But in 1559, Knox returned to Scotland and became a vocal proponent of Reformed theology and the concept of Presbyterian leadership in the church. So a number of Scottish lords had already been promoting religious reform, and they gladly supported John Knox's teachings. Under Knox's leadership, these lords of the congregation wrote the Scottish Confession of Faith in 1560. This confession ended papal rule in Scotland and outlawed the Mass, and so it actually went the other direction. So in 1560, that confession that these lords wrote under Knox's leadership actually ended the Pope's jurisdiction in Scotland and then actually outlawed Catholic Mass, which is really amazing that actually Knox was able to accomplish that. Again, if you're a Catholic, that's not necessarily good, but with the abuses he perceived, that was what he put his mind to. But the Scottish Confession remained the primary doctrinal guide for the Church of Scotland until the Westminster Confession of Faith in 1647. And in the early 1600s, King James I sent many Scottish Presbyterians to Northern Ireland in an effort to displace the Irish and establish British control there. And by the early 1700s, these Scotsmen were ready to migrate to America because of the economic trials they faced in Ireland. And so the first presbytery in America was formed in 1706 in Philadelphia. And Presbyterianism spread rapidly in the colonies. And so Philadelphia was home to the very first Presbyterian church. And one distinctive of the Presbyterian church has been their emphasis on education. And so not far out of Philadelphia was New Jersey. Princeton University was founded as a Presbyterian school. And that was a big part of it. In the colonial period, the Presbyterian church required advanced theological training for its ministers, whereas the Methodists and Baptists often allowed untrained men who were zealous for the gospel to carry a ministry. And so what that means is basically the Presbyterians had a high standard of, unless you're theologically educated, you couldn't go and spread the gospel, whereas the Methodists and the Baptists, they allowed sort of untrained people to go and spread the gospel. And so the Presbyterians had sort of a high standard. And so the result was fewer Presbyterian frontier preachers, but more theologians and seminary teachers. And so that kind of makes sense too, is they were focused on more education. So you saw that go through the schools and the seminaries rather than out in the public. Even today, more theologians come from Presbyterian or Reformed backgrounds than from other groups. And Presbyterian theologians have made significant contributions to issues concerning the church. Throughout the history of the Presbyterian church, there have been splits and mergers based on theological and practical issues. Like I told you, something as simple as instruments. The Great Awakening, which began in Presbyterian churches during the colonial period, prompted a disagreement between the old side Presbyterians and the new side Presbyterians. And so the new side supported the revivalists of the Great Awakening as instruments of the Holy Spirit, but the old side disdained their lack of traditional theological training and considered the whole revival to be simply a faddish movement. So there was this tension within. The split lasted from 1741 to 1758, when the two factions reached a formal agreement with each other and made peace. Later, latent old side, new side differences led to the formation of a new denomination, the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, in 1810. And then in 1837, during the Second Great Awakening, the Presbyterians were split between old school and new school churches. The new school taught a modified understanding of sin and holiness and downplayed the need for traditional Presbyterian church polity. And when the two groups merged again in 1869, it was with an increased tolerance for doctrinal diversity, and this led to a greater change in the early 20th century. And then also until the 1930s, Presbyterians held a leading role in the various debates over doctrinal integrity, meaning the integrity of the Bible. Some of the key men supporting the Bible Conference movement were C.I. Scofield, that was a pretty famous name, 1843 to 1921. James Brooks from 1830 to 1897, and then William J. Erdman from 1834 to 1923. Billy Sunday from 1863 to 1935. William Biderwolf from 1867 to 1939, and then J. Wilbur Chapman from 1859 to 1918. And so with doctrinal liberalism creeping into their seminaries, Presbyterians such as Lewis Talbot, who lived from 1889 to 1976, Lewis Sperry Chafer from 1871 to 1952, and William Anderson from 1889 to 1935 helped start the new Bible colleges. And so that was sort of also, again, a reaction to doctrinal liberalism. And so you have this tension between theological liberalism and theological conservatism, and conservatism moving away from liberalism and liberalism moving away from conservatism. And it's like politics, not understanding each other, right? But as Presbyterian conservatives saw the Presbyterian church continue to tolerate doctrinal error, they led their churches to form new groups. And so again, is that conservative reaction to liberals. In 1936, Princeton theologian J. Gresham Machen formed the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. And then in 1938, Carl McIntyre and others formed the Bible Presbyterian Church and ordained Francis Schaeffer as the denomination's first minister. I read a book of his once, actually. He's a pretty famous name, Francis Schaeffer. In 1973, the Presbyterian Church in America, or PCA, broke from what is now the Presbyterian Church, USA. And so they were split, actually. I know their names are very similar, so it's kind of confusing, but that was over the liberalism of the latter. So Presbyterian Church USA became a little too liberal, And so the Presbyterian Church in America broke away from that because they were the more conservative variety. But in 1981, the Evangelical Presbyterian Church was formed as another conservative alternative for Presbyterians dismayed by the heretical leanings of the mainstream Presbyterian Church. And so, again, conservatism reacting to liberalism. And it's the same thing you see within Lutherans, too. Like Lutherans have the more liberal varieties, and then there's the Missouri Synod of Lutheranism, which is very conservative. And they're constantly reacting to each other. And so while most Presbyterian churches will agree on general themes such as the depravity of man, the holiness of God, and salvation by faith, there is a wide divergence in how they define and apply those themes. Some churches treat sin as a disease and essentially erase any personal responsibility, while others hold a firm line that sin is a violation of God's unchanging law. And so some Presbyterian churches teach that the Bible is the verbally inspired, infallible word of God, while others teach that it is a human book subject to error. So a wide variety of when we say Presbyterian, that's a very wide variety, a very large net of ideas that don't necessarily agree with each other or seen uniformly. Depending on the denomination, you might have some that are very strict in how they interpret the Bible. Some are a little bit more liberal. Some are, they think it's the word of God. Others see it as a fallible book. And so very, very divergent theories. But some Presbyterians believe that Jesus is the virgin-born Son of God, and others deny his divine nature. And so even the idea that Jesus might not be God is present within some Presbyterian ideas. I've never heard of that, but it's definitely certainly possible. Obviously it exists. I just haven't seen it myself. And so I wanted to talk about too. So John Calvin, and there's the source on that, but what John Calvin had to say about animals. And I thought this was really important too, because Calvin was another one, kind of like Martin Luther, that, he wasn't the most, the easiest modern read. And Calvin is notoriously difficult to understand too. So I was really glad because someone actually translated his words, because he speaks in that sort of old English and it's very hard to understand what he's saying exactly. And so you'll see a lot of that too, is that he says it and then a translator maybe says it better for our time and place, where it's like, oh, that's what he meant by that. But one sort of universal quote of his I found, it said, a dog barks when his master is attacked. I would be a coward if I saw that God's truth is attacked and yet would remain silent. And so that's sort of a backwards or a backhanded way of complimenting dogs, because he's saying that, dogs are loyal to their master. And in the same way, I am loyal to God. And so just like a dog barks when his master is attacked, I plan to be the same way when God's truth is attacked. So John Calvin, there were some words about him that was said. It says, John Calvin, the reformer, takes a similar view to Luther, and this was regarding animals on the new earth or in the afterlife. It says, commenting on Romans 8:21, which describes creation as subject to frustration. And just as a refresher, Romans 8:21 says the creation, or animals, will be set free from death and decay like God's children or humans. And so set free from death and decay. And he cites that and he says, Calvin writes, thus the condemnation of mankind is imprinted on the heavens and on the earth and all creatures. It hence also appears to what excelling glory the sons of God shall be exalted. For all creatures shall be renewed in order to amplify it and to render it illustrious. But he's careful not to go beyond the text. But he means that not all creatures shall be partakers of the same glory with the sons of God, but they, according to their nature, shall be participators of a better condition. For God will restore a perfect state of the world now fallen together with mankind. And so he's saying that animals will be resurrected, even though it might not be all of them, which is pretty good. But what that perfection will be as to the beasts as well as the plants and the metals is not meet nor right in us to inquire more curiously. For the chief effect of corruption is decay. And so the author says, if Calvin is right, we will see animals on the new earth, but we can't be sure which ones, is sort of what they said. And so I thought that was really interesting. And there's more quotes a little bit later. I found another source. But in the meantime, one thing I wanted to talk about was Douglas Wilson. I tried to look up like famous Presbyterians, and I didn't actually recognize a lot of names. Douglas Wilson was a name that stood out, and my father-in-law loves to listen to him, and he's pretty funny. He's a little bit obnoxious sometimes, but especially like in the words that he uses. And he's kind of, my brother-in-law calls him spicy, and I think that's probably a way to put it. He's very prone to criticism and sort of vile. Like he's not very sympathetic to a lot of things, and he kind of runs his mouth a little too much, in my opinion. But Douglas Wilson is the pastor of Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho, and Wilson began his ministry without any formal theological training, but he considers himself to be historically Calvinistic and Presbyterian. And so you'll see that too, is that a lot of times Presbyterians are Calvinistic. They sort of go together, very well, because Calvin was sort of the author of both. And so this article, it says Animals and the Resurrection by Douglas Wilson. And he cites, I believe it's the KJV here, but it says, but some man will say, how are the dead raised up? And with what body do they come? Thou fool, that which thou sowest is not quickened, except it die. And that which thou sowest not that body that shall be, but bare grain. It may chance of wheat or of some other grain, but God giveth a body as it hath pleased him, and every seed his own body. All flesh is not the same flesh, but there is one kind of flesh of man, another flesh of beasts, another of fishes, and another of birds. And that's 1 Corinthians 15:35-39. And what Paul is saying there too, I believe it's Sosthenes, they wrote that basically saying that man will be resurrected, or believers of Christ will be resurrected in the end times, because they're kind of like a seed. A man dies, and women, they get placed in the ground, and then they sprout up like a plant. And it's the same thing with the body, is the man and women die, and then they're sprouted up and become a new resurrected body. But he says, man is not the only type of seed. He says the other seeds are flesh of beasts, or flesh of animals, fishes, and another for birds. And so he sort of distinguishes there about there's a different type of seed that goes into the ground and then that will be resurrected, which are fish, birds, and animals. Why he makes that distinction, I think that might have to do with Genesis 1. But regardless, Douglas Wilson comments and says, the skeptic can make no sense of resurrection. What kind of body could the dead have? The whole thing seems nonsensical, but the existence of a second body is no more marvelous in principle than the first one is. Paul rebukes the folly that cannot see that the human body is a seed. First, he notes that in order to be fruitful, a seed must die first. The second observation is that the body of the seed and the body of the plant that grows from it are strikingly different. There is continuity between them, obviously, but there is a large amount of visual discontinuity as well. So when the seed goes into the ground, we should expect two things from it. One is life from death, and the second is that life will be astonishingly different. Paul follows the logic out. There are more kinds of seed than simply the human. Just as God creates wheat and other kinds of grain, so also he has created human body seeds and other body seeds. The four kinds of seed he mentions are men, animals, fish, and birds. And so, will animals participate in the resurrection? Well, are they seed? So that's a pretty implied way of saying, yes, animals will experience resurrection, because just like humans, they are a type of seed. And then they will die, they will be put in the ground, and then they will resurrect just like a plant does, sprouts up. And so humans, as well as all kinds of animals, will sprout up on the new earth and resurrect, and they'll be immortal. And that was the source there too on his website. He's got a cool blog, and it's kind of like his sarcasm too. He has a blog called Blog and Mablog, which is sort of a play on Revelation, where it says Gog and Magog. So he's clever. He is clever. I'll give him that. It's just he's like I said, he's a little too vitriolic for my liking. Insensitive as well sometimes, but some people's taste, not necessarily mine. And then he had another article that says Until Someone Unsettles It by Douglas Wilson. And he kind of criticizes evolution and talks about how it's not compatible with the book of Genesis. And he says, and this, what he says implies that he believes animals will be resurrected on the new earth, because he says, first, the Bible teaches from beginning to end that the plan of salvation is intended to restore the entire created order. In Genesis, we were banished from Eden and the tree of life, and at the end of Revelation, the tree of life is there beckoning us with leaves for the healing of the nations. And so he's talking about Revelation 22. God restores Eden again. And in that return to the Edenic state, he says, God includes the creatures, which means that those creatures were included in the bliss we fell from. Why would they be restored with us if they didn't fall with us? And then he cites Isaiah 65:25 to say that the animals, just like they were in Eden, they will be on the new earth with us, only in resurrected bodies. And he says, he quotes, it says, the wolf and the lamb shall feed together, and the lion shall eat straw like the bullock or the snake. And dust shall be the serpent's meat. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountains, saith the Lord. Isaiah 65:25. And so he uses Isaiah 65:25 to say that there will be animals on the new earth. And then there's the source for that as well. And then I found this source too. I think these are probably genuine writings because I give citations. I'm always a little bit leery I didn't really get a chance to look them up in the books because I didn't really have access to the books, but I trust their citations. But a lot of this gets a little bit confusing because there's multiple translations of what Calvin is saying. But anyways, I found a lot of quotes related to his sympathetic understanding of animals, which is really nice to hear. So the writings of John Calvin from 1509 to 1564 form the foundation of the Presbyterian Church USA. And according to Calvin, animals are children of God and deserve to be treated with care and justice. And I'll talk about that quote. And I had a source. I had a quote or a comment. Tanya said, "Love that verse." Oh yes, me too, me too. I absolutely Isaiah 65:25, probably my second favorite after Isaiah 11:6-9, and I love Revelation 21:4 as well. There shall not he will wipe every tear from their eyes. Yeah, you remember it. But so yeah, according to Calvin, animals are children of God and deserve to be treated with care and justice, and that's something that he said. And indeed, the need to provide animals with adequate care was so important to Calvin that he listed as one of the few acceptable reasons to be absent from church on Sundays. And so it's interesting that he said that, and you'll see that too in his later quotes. He says, but he said this. This is sort of another implied way of complimenting animals. He said, "The meanest animals are equally the children of God because they were created of the original seed of the Word of God." And so there he's saying that, animals are important because they come from the hand of God. And that was from John Calvin, Institutes of the Christian Religion, Volume 1. And that was translated by John Allen. And then this one, too, this is really interesting, this commentary. Calvin says, "For it is written in the law of Moses, thou shalt not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treadeth out the corn. Doth God take care of oxen? It is an unjust thing that the husbandman should lay out his pains to no purpose in plowing and threshing, but then at the end of his labor in the hope of receiving the fruits. As it is so, we may infer that this belongs to oxen also." And so he's saying there the same thing with Paul is this idea that, just like it's cruel to muzzle the ox when he's treading out the grain or when he's eating the grain and he's working for it, so he should be compensated. It's the same thing that should be understood for pastors. And then Calvin goes, he realizes it's for both, because he says if oxen are able to be compensated for their work, then so should humans. And so that was a pretty inclusive way of understanding that. And I think that's how it should be understood. And that was John Calvin, Commentary on the Epistles of Paul, the Apostle to the Corinthians, Volume 1. And that was John Pringle that translated it. And then Calvin also said this. It says, "But it must be remembered that men are required to practice justice even in dealing with animals." And so that was something he said. And that was from John Calvin, Ordinances for the Supervision of Churches in the Country. And so he also said, Calvin said, "Scripture declares that earthly blessings have been given by us by all the kindness of God and appointed for our use under the condition of being regarded as trusts, of which we must one day give account. We must therefore administer them as if we were constantly heard the word sounding in our ears, give an account of your stewardship." And that was from John Calvin, Institutes of the Christian Religion, Volume 2, translated by Henry Beveridge. But there was a summarized version, I think, that said it better. It said, Calvin said, better translated, "God has placed the creatures of the earth in trust to humanity, and one day will require us to give an account of the ways in which we have used or abused that trust. We should treat creation as though we constantly hear God whispering, 'Give an account of your stewardship.'" And so he's saying that we are accountable for the ways that we treat animals. And so that was a very positive quote. And then further summarized, even maybe more succinct, it says, "God will require us to give an account of the way we have treated his creatures." And that's probably the most straightforward way of putting it. And then there was a comment that came through. Luke said, "Hi, Matthew. Thanks, Luke. Thanks for stopping by. I appreciate it. Always good to have you. Thank you for all the work you do, too, with Creation Care Church, spreading the message in England and UK. Great work. Always love what you do." And so God, therefore, this is what Calvin said, "God, therefore, presents before us and his creatures a bright mirror of his admirable wisdom, so that everyone that looks upon the world and the other works of God must of necessity break forth in admiration of him, if he has a single spark of sound judgment." And that was from John Calvin in Calvin's Bible Commentaries, Corinthians Part 1, and that was translated by John King, no relation. But a further summarized version, Calvin said, same quote, only summarized a little bit better, "Animals reflect God's wisdom. We should strive to understand and love them. And then sort of a commentary on that quote. For Calvin, animals provide a mirror that reflects the wisdom and goodness of God. Knowledge of God can be gained through knowledge of God's creatures, so we should dwell long upon them and fix them deeply in our heart. And so I thought that was a really great quote. And Calvin had some very positive things to say about animals. And Luke said, "Thank you, Matthew, for all the good work you do too." Thank you so much, Luke. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. And we both have a love for God's creatures, and that's Proverbs 12:10, right? The good man takes care of the animals, and it's so true. And Tanya said Ecclesiastes 3:19, so true, right? All is vanity. Man and animals go to the same place. That's right. And so Calvin also further said, "It were indeed a strange defense for man to pretend that he has no ears to hear the truth, while dumb creatures," he means dumb in the traditional context meant just speechless, and then it got sort of used to like say that someone is not very smart. And so when he says dumb, he's not using it as an insult like we do today. Like Ellen G. White had the same thing. But anyways, he said, if it were indeed a strange defense for man to pretend that he has no ears to hear the truth, while dumb creatures have voices loud enough to declare it, to allege that he is unable to see that which creatures without eyes demonstrate, to excuse himself on the ground of weakness of mind, while all creatures without reason are able to teach. Wherefore, when we wander and go astray, we are justly shut out from every species of excuse, because all things point to the right path. And so there is that example too of where Calvin is kind of difficult to understand. I couldn't tell you what that means in plain English. I would have to break it down in multiple steps, but luckily they break it down a little bit further. From John Calvin, Institutes of the Christian Religion, Volume 1, and that's Henry Beveridge translated. And then Calvin also said, "Undoubtedly, were one to attempt to speak in due terms of the inestimable wisdom, power, justice, and goodness of God in the formation of the world, no grace or splendor of diction could equal the greatness of the subject. Still, there can be no doubt that the Lord would have us constantly occupied with such holy meditation, in order that, while we contemplate the immense treasures of wisdom and goodness exhibited in the creatures, as in so many mirrors, we may not only run our eye over them with a hasty, as if it were evanescent glance, but dwell long upon them, seriously and faithfully turn them into our minds, and every now and then bring them to recollection." And so he says basically that we should admire animals, and we should respect animals and look at them with awe, because they are a reflection, a mirror of our Creator. And so that was a really nice quote that Calvin said. And again, that was from John Calvin, Institutes of the Christian Religion, translated by Henry Beveridge. And then here's another quote from it. It says, "Therefore, in order to be compendious, let the reader understand that he has a genuine apprehension of the character of God as the creator of the world. First, if he attends to the general rule, never thoughtlessly or obliviously to overlook the glorious perfections which God displays in his creatures. And secondly, if he makes a self-application of what he sees so as to fix it deeply on his heart." And that was from John Calvin, Institutes of the Christian Religion, Volume 1. And then this was a little bit of commentary on it, but he said, "Calvin's call to care for animals has a firm foundation in Scripture." He explains the PCUSA, and I think that's one of the more liberal churches, but that's okay. "Although Genesis gives humanity dominion over creation, this term is synonymous with service and stewardship, not with exploitation." And I'm not a fan of that word stewardship. I think that's kind of vague, because it basically means, that can be interpreted a lot of ways, but I like when they say dominion over creation is synonymous with service, not with exploitation. And I think that's something that's important, is we're to serve creation. We're the servant species, as Andrew Lindsay says, and Jason Bueno is always taking up to account, is that we are the servant species. And that I think they nailed that right. And they said the biblical injunction to care for all God's creatures has inspired the PCUSA to ask its members to live our beliefs out about justice. Live our beliefs about justice by reducing or eliminating their consumption of meat. The intensive factory farming of animals has led to massive water pollution, adverse effects on human health, and an unjust distribution of vital resources and animal suffering. So that was a church document that said that the PCUSA asked its members to refrain from meat because of all the problems that's associated with it, including animal suffering. And so that's a very good Presbyterian outlook too, is that Presbyterians have long been at the forefront of social justice, and Presbyterians are very much a denomination I admire because of that. But there's a source for that. And finally, just to close out, Presbyterianism Presbyterianism has a long history of speaking kindly about animals, which continues to this day. And I know a lot of Presbyterians actually that speak very kindly about animals. And I could, I could rattle them on for a long time. I've met a lot of Presbyterians that are very sympathetic to the cause of animal rights, and it kind of goes with the territory. Presbyterians have long been at the forefront of social justice, and it's something that we should admire for that. But that's the end of it. I'm going to close out in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for allowing me to study the history of men that studied you and your word, and help us to reflect their views of animals, and help us to live out creation care, and to look forward and to help create a world where the wolf will lay with the lamb and a child will take care of them. And so that's the end of my conversation. I'm going to be coming back in 2 weeks with Congregationalism, which is another denomination, a little bit less well known. But regardless, yeah, Congregationalism is also sort of in that Reformed tradition. And so that's something that we'll go over, and we'll talk about what they have to say about animals, most importantly. And so, yeah, I hope you like this presentation, and then I'll see you in 2 weeks with Congregationalism. But thank you guys so much for tuning in, and have a great Sunday, and have a great rest of your week and following week. Thanks.